All right, welcome everybody. I'm Yana Ludwig, and I am running for Wyoming's open U.S. Senate seat. And today's video is on the core principles driving my campaign and why I'm leading with questions in addition to policy specifics. So running only on specific proposals doesn't help much in terms of knowing who somebody will be once they get into office. Much of the job of a US Senator is kind of unanticipatable. While you're running, you might know what you want to propose once you get there, but you have no idea what other senators are going to propose or what the House might be sending you, and that you'll have to weigh in on and decide how to vote on. And then things like 9/11 or COVID-19 happen, and suddenly you're in territory you never expected to be asked to lead in. So knowing the foundation from which someone will lead is therefore a lot more important than having a few clever ideas that they might have at the outset. It seems better to give you a glimpse into how I think about things and what kinds of questions I'd be asking, in addition to the ideas that I already have. And most of our town halls have been that version. They've been a deeper dive about my current take on some known policy area. So today is about the basis of my approach and some talk about where that gets us in partnership together. On the policy platform page of the Yana for WYO website, I start out with 3 core questions that I'm committing to asking about everything that comes across my desk. They are: 1, how does this affect the economic security of working class and poor people? 2, how does this affect human rights and civil rights? And 3, how does it affect the climate? So these are not hard questions for me to be asking. It really just took a little bit of thought for me to figure out, like, what is it that I've been asking all along? So these questions have really driven my nonprofit work, my activism, and my community building through the years. The core principles of my life have been community, sustainability or resilience, justice, and compassion. And those are the same principles that I'm taking into politics with this campaign. And I do know some of the policies that that kind of questions generate. So here's a few examples. It means Medicare for all, which is both a human rights and an economic security issue. A world with Medicare for all is a world where we all have reliable health care. It also relates to the second question because poor people disproportionately includes trans people and people of color, and their healthcare outcomes are especially bad in a lot of cases. It's a world where we all have reproductive health care, a world where things like coronavirus are slowed significantly because everybody can go to the doctor. We are seeing in Wyoming and across the US how a health crisis disproportionately hurts vulnerable populations, and that not enough people in government are looking out for those groups. In Washington right now, it's almost as if the question is, what big corporation can we bail out next, rather than how does this affect working class and poor people? We also need Medicare for all because we have a suicide epidemic in Wyoming, and that isn't going to change as long as mental health coverage is not widely available. If American core values are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we don't get the first of those without universal health care, which includes mental health. So these questions also point to a Green New Deal that is as much about jobs creation and racial justice as it is about environmental policy. I explicitly named climate as one of my core questions because it is actually an existential threat to all of us. But it's also here because I believe that a stable environment is a human right. Now, as a side note, the interesting thing to me about these 3 questions is that none of them can be fully addressed without the others. And it's particularly easy to see that with the Green New Deal, how all of these priorities can come together. It's not about anybody waiting their turn. We actually need to be moving all of these progressive agendas forward together if we want to make progress on any of them. The questions also point to protecting and restoring voting rights, including for people with felonies, and making sure that Indigenous people are able to use their tribal IDs. Questions also point to rights to protest, which are significantly undermined right now, especially for environmental protests, immigration protests, and Indigenous people and other people of color protesting pretty much anything. While armed white men can enter Capitol buildings around the country because they're miffed about having to wear masks in public, Indigenous people are still getting rubber bullets and water cannons for protecting their land and water. This is not even-handed application of civil rights. The questions also mean a lot for worker protections. It's not just raising the minimum wage, although that's a good start. It's also about even having a minimum wage for not just tipped employees, but also entry-level military enlisted personnel, farm workers, and incarcerated people who can still legally be enslaved and are, and for people under 20 who are in the first few months of their jobs. All of those are excluded groups. So when we think about a minimum wage, we really need to take into account the fact that it is not truly a minimum wage for everybody. Worker rights also means that you can't be fired or forced to go to work when you're sick, which is obviously up right now in many places and for many people. It also means that you can take time off when you have kids and that your working conditions are humane. If we had stronger worker protections right now, many of our essential workers would be receiving hazard pay and proper protective gear for their work instead of being basically treated as sacrificial lambs. So one more example, the questions point to legalizing pot so that we stop locking people up for possession of a substance that many of us use for pain management and mental health maintenance, and allowing the creation of more good paying jobs in all states, but especially for more rural ones like Wyoming. So I do know some of the policies that these questions would generate, but I don't know all of them. I believe that voters have a right to know things like what questions someone would be asking on their behalf. One of my biggest frustrations in politics right now is that I see so many elected officials basically asking the wrong questions. They're asking what their wealthy donors want. They are asking how we preserve a system of power in this country that fundamentally disenfranchises millions of people. And they are asking how they themselves can play the game skillfully enough that they stay in power. They are not asking the right questions about how we have a livable future or a just one. So I'm committing to asking those right questions. So I've lived out two of Wyoming's possible futures in my life, and I believe that those two futures were basically generated by the kinds of questions that were or weren't being asked at the time. So my hometown is Iron River, Michigan, up in the Upper Peninsula, and my family got there about a generation and a half out from iron ore mining, leaving the county completely. And that childhood, while super joyful in terms of being able to run around in the woods and swim in clean waters, was rough around the edges as well. We had suicides. We had kids coming to school without lunch. We had, in short, economic despair. What we are seeing today with coal and the politics of denial around its demise reminds me really strongly of what my hometown did, or more importantly, didn't do. Questions were not being asked about a post-iron ore future in Iron River. And we need to be asking questions about what a post-carbon future means for Wyoming. The other possible future for Wyoming that I've lived out was when I lived for 8.5 years in a place called Dancing Rabbit Eco Village, which was a then 75-person village built entirely around the values of sustainability and community. We operated at about 10% of the US average of resource consumption without it feeling like a big deprivation trip. And we used even less fossil fuels than that. So questions were being asked about a post-carbon future. We were asking about things like fairness and inclusion. We were asking about how to solve problems and weren't ignoring pesky things like data and facts. So what made that village work, and it's about the same size as some of our smaller communities here in Wyoming. In fact, it's quite a bit bigger than some of them, was that work around deliberation on the right questions. And we were doing it as a collective, knowing that we were all in it together and that we would all be affected deeply by the answers that we came up. It was a really good life, and I want that life for Wyoming as our future. And I think we need that collective sense of fate here in Wyoming and in the US as a whole. We need to see each other not only as partners, but as people with a real stake in the outcomes of whatever it is that we're deciding. So the other thing that intersects with all of these questions for me is our notions about freedom. So freedom is definitely about human rights and civil rights, but it's also about what you are able to do and not do, not just on paper, but in your daily life. So freedom for me is increasingly also about economic security. Freedom to go to the doctor when you need to, or take your kids or parents when they need to go. The freedom to get the kind of education you want, whether that's trade school or a college degree, or simply having some leisure time to learn a new skill on YouTube or read an occasional book. Freedom to have kids, which is something that a lot of young people are choosing to not do despite desperately wanting them because they know they can't afford it. So more abstract and less material versions of freedom are definitely important, but they are not immediate in the same way that our economic circumstances are. So freedom doesn't mean a lot if your farm is underwater for the third time in 12 years with a so-called 100-year flood, because the climate is destabilizing and your farm was your security. It doesn't mean a lot if you're working 2 or 3 jobs and still can't afford a decent place to live. It doesn't mean a lot when 60% of the US can't handle a $400 emergency without it being a crisis. These kinds of freedoms that I'm talking about, they're not won by endless wars. They are won at the ballot box, they're won in union halls, and they're won in the streets protesting. And what all of these have in common is that how we've structured our economy and the power it gives to some and not others. So questions of the economy are tangled into every aspect of our lives. They're not at all abstract or distant. They are what you eat for dinner tonight, where you live, and increasingly what keeps us up at night. And so when I'm talking about those questions, I lead with economic security. So again, my 3 questions are, how does this affect the economic security of working class and poor people? How does it affect human rights and civil rights? How does it affect the climate? So I'm going to encourage everybody to ask politicians at all levels of government what questions they're asking when they're looking at potential proposals. And chances are they can't, or maybe they won't tell you what questions they're actually asking. So speaking of questions, I want to segue into what questions folks have today and what you all want to talk about. So joined today by Glenn and Sean. Nice to have you both here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Yana. Yeah, just a quick question. So, obviously, you're talking about bringing, your personal ideas and representing your constituents in DC. This week there was a poll that showed that Medicare for All is wildly popular with the public. So 69% of general voters like it, 88% of Democrats, and almost half of Republicans. So there's generally a consensus that Medicare for All is a good idea. How would you deal with going to Washington, saying you're going to support this legislation, and then it being held up in the Senate or the House? What would your response be to that?
Well, I mean, I think any given senator is only going to be able to do as much as they're going to be able to do. I mean, I'm definitely going to be, using that polling data and like bringing it into the conversations. And, I think one of the reasons why it's really important that we flip the Senate is that discrepancy between Democrats and Republicans in those polls that, Democrats basically think this is a really good idea. And I think that people who are elected as Democrats are going to be more likely to be willing to push for it. One of my frustrations is that politicians typically are more conservative than their constituents. And that's true with both Democrats and Republicans. For whatever reason, they feel like they have to run more to the right and they have to vote more to the right than they actually are. And I suspect that's about money in politics, basically. And so, one of the things that I do think is pretty important is like working to overturn Citizens United, because that is the sort of kingpin with a whole bunch of this stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think we just need to like keep hammering the message home that like, hey, people want this thing. And I think also, educating people more about what private insurance really is all about is pretty critical. I think most people think of private insurance as being a good thing because they think that it's giving them something. But actually what private insurance really is just gatekeeping. It's like somebody has the ability to tell me when I can go to the doctor, what kinds of care I can get, what kinds of tests I can get. And it's not my doctor. It's a private insurance company that is gatekeeping that. And about 30% of the total US healthcare budget is private insurance costs. It's not healthcare, actually, it's that. And so just like, working on taking my educator hat with me to DC and like continuing to be talking about stuff in, data driven ways for people and like helping people understand what's actually going on with some of this stuff. So I think that's probably the best that I'd be able to do as a junior senator.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem.
Hi, Yana.
Hey,
Um, I actually, while you were talking about your three questions, I thought about something I was reading related to how news is presented and the topics of, so in Europe, or actually I think a few countries, they have laws centered around how journalism and news is presented, and we're definitely more lax. I know that especially in the 80s, we started taking out some of the restrictions so that like certain news could be allowed, even if it was considered not fact checked, or in some
Mhm.
ways was more opinionated, so the commentator sort of aspect. And I wonder if, especially with information education, how your focus is, I wonder how could we utilize sort of a change in how information is presented.
Mhm.
Would you think that would be something that is necessary for the future in terms of educating the public, or how we're presenting topics and some of the issues we're having currently? And how do you think we might go about that, especially when people are like, no, that's freedom of speech, or they
Mhm.
sort of
Mhm.
attribute it, like you said, to those large themes rather than what about the daily life, like you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and actually, I think there's parallels to two things with the press. I mean, I absolutely think that we need some changes with the press. I mean, Fox News is not news. It's like
Mm-hmm.
entertainment that's masquerading as news. And I think increasingly a lot of other mainstream media is that as well, unfortunately. Like it's all sort of drifted to the right. And I think there's a parallel to Citizens United with that. And I think there's a parallel to how we think about freedom with that. I think both of those things are in play here. And so just like, I don't think that money should be considered like political speech. I also don't think it should be considered speech in terms of being able to feed into the press. And so, one of the things that Donald Trump's administration has done has actually undermined public media. And so, he's gone after PBS, gone after a whole bunch of these different entities. And I think that we should also be doing some looking at like, how do we get money out of media? And like big media has kind of taken over. And like we just saw this past week in Laramie, which is my hometown right now, the Laramie Boomerang has decided to not print their Tuesday edition anymore because they're going down. I mean, they're a small town newspaper, pretty independent, and they're not making it. And so I think like, really looking at sort of that behind the scenes stuff, and working on getting the big money out of our press is part of it. And I also think like, thinking about freedom of press a little bit differently. Like it's not freedom to print whatever the hell you want to print, in spite of the impacts that that's going to have on the people that are reading whatever it is that you're printing or broadcasting. But I do think that we could be looking at and asking like, well, what would freedom be for your average person in relation to the press? And I think that would be, access to good fact-checked, data-driven information. And I think, I think human interest stories are still really important. I think storytelling is an incredibly powerful thing. And so I wouldn't want that to completely go away. And that's definitely not what I'm advocating for. But I do think moving to some sort of a fact-checking standard, like, as you say, we have in some other countries, would be a very, very good idea. And this is all so much wrapped up. I mean, the same people who own the big media outlets are the same people who are buying politicians. And so I think really, in some ways, my campaign and the fact that I'm a socialist means that I actually don't think there should be like a separate owning class from the working class. And that would apply to the press as well.
Thank you. That's perfect.
Okay, great. Either of you want to ask any other questions, or should we wrap this up for today? All right, great. Well, thank you for being here. And I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. Want to give you a quick look ahead. Like sometime in the next few weeks, we're going to be doing a special session on public banking. This is a topic that is, it's a little bit niche, but it's actually really interesting to think about in terms of Wyoming right now. And are also going to be looking a little bit at like what is fascism and how do we actually fight fascism. So those are a couple upcoming topics that weren't on the upcoming topics list that I shared a little while ago. And so I wanted to add those to your list and tune in. Those topics will be coming soon. Thanks for being here and thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.